Paulo Freire's literacy campaign in Brazil. In 1963, Brazilian educator Paulo Freire launched a literacy campaign that taught 300 illiterate sugarcane workers to read and write in just 45 days. This wasn't just teaching the alphabet, it was teaching critical consciousness. Students learned to read while also learning to analyze their social conditions. Freire's method worked by using words from students' daily lives. Instead of "see Dick run," students learned words like favela, slum, trabalho, work, and salario, salary. They learned to read by reading about their own lives. Then they learned to question those lives. The method was called conscientization, developing critical awareness of social reality through reflection and action. Students didn't just decode words, they decoded their world. They learned that poverty wasn't natural or inevitable, but was created by specific social structures that could be changed. The results were extraordinary. In 45 days, illiterate workers could read newspapers, write letters, and most importantly, understand political speeches and propaganda. They could analyze what politicians were promising and demanding accountability. More than that, they were discussing land reform, labor rights, and political organization. The Brazilian government was impressed. President João Goulart approved a national literacy program based on Freire's method. The plan was to teach 2 million illiterate adults to read in 1964. Literacy circles were established across Brazil. Teachers were trained in 20,000 culture circles nationwide. Materials were prepared. The infrastructure was ready. The scale was unprecedented. If successful, Brazil would eliminate adult illiteracy within a few years. Millions of poor adults would gain the ability to read, write, and think critically about their conditions. They would be able to vote. Literacy was required for voting, which kept millions of poor people disenfranchised. Then the military staged a coup in April 1964. One of their first actions was shutting down the literacy program. Freire was arrested, imprisoned for 70 days, and then exiled. His books were banned, the literacy materials were destroyed, teachers were arrested, the culture circles were raided by police. Why? Because literate poor people are dangerous. The landowners and military officers who ran Brazil depended on illiterate workers who couldn't read contracts, couldn't understand their rights, couldn't organize effectively. Freire's program was teaching workers to read and think critically, to question why they were poor while landowners were rich. The coup leaders explicitly stated that Freire's program was subversive. They were right. Teaching the poor to read and think critically is subversive to systems that require an ignorant underclass. Workers who had learned to read were already organizing for land reform and higher wages. The literacy program threatened the entire social order. Freire spent 16 years in exile, first in Bolivia, then Chile, then Geneva. His methods were adopted in dozens of other countries: Chile, Nicaragua, Guinea-Bissau, Tanzania, wherever revolutionary movements wanted to educate the poor. UNESCO adopted his methods for literacy campaigns worldwide. But in Brazil, his program was destroyed and banned for decades. The military dictatorship lasted until 1985. During those 21 years, millions of Brazilians remained illiterate who could have been taught to read in 45 days. This wasn't an accident or bureaucratic failure, it was deliberate policy. An illiterate population is easier to control. They can't read opposition newspapers. They can't organize based on written materials. They can't fully participate in democracy. Freire's literacy program was defunded and destroyed, not because it didn't work. It worked spectacularly. It was destroyed because educated poor people started demanding land reform, workers' rights, and political participation. That was unacceptable to those in power. Better to keep millions illiterate than to risk them learning to read and demand justice. The Freedom Schools. During the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer, civil rights activists established freedom schools to educate black children and adults who had been denied quality education by segregated schools. Over 40 schools were created across Mississippi, teaching over 3,000 students in just 2 months. The freedom schools didn't just teach reading and math. They taught black history, the history that segregated schools refused to teach. They taught about slavery, Reconstruction, and the ongoing struggle for civil rights. They taught students that their poverty and oppression weren't natural, but were created by specific policies and could be changed through collective action. The curriculum was revolutionary. Students studied African civilizations before slavery, learned about black scientists and inventors, read Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois, and analyzed contemporary civil rights struggles. They learned they had a history worth knowing and a future worth fighting for. Students thrived. Children who had been labeled slow or stupid in segregated schools excelled in freedom schools. They were reading above grade level within months. They were writing essays, analyzing political speeches, and questioning why things were the way they were. Many students later said freedom schools changed their lives more than any other educational experience. Adults attended night classes to learn to read so they could pass voter registration tests. Mississippi used literacy tests to prevent black people from voting, tests that were intentionally impossible to pass even for educated people. Freedom schools taught adults to read well enough that they couldn't be denied registration based on literacy. The schools were revolutionary in pedagogy too. Instead of rote memorization and corporal punishment common in segregated schools, they used discussion-based learning. Students analyzed texts, debated ideas, and connected their education to their lived experiences. This developed critical thinking skills that segregated schools deliberately avoided teaching. Teachers treated students as intellectuals capable of complex thought. They asked questions like, what does the majority culture have that we want? And what does the majority culture have that we don't want? These questions encouraged students to think critically about power, culture, and what kind of society they wanted to build. White supremacists recognized the threat immediately. Freedom schools were bombed, burned, and shot at. Teachers were harassed, beaten, and threatened. 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were murdered by Ku Klux Klan members, partly because of their involvement in freedom schools. But the greater threat came from economic pressure. Freedom schools depended on volunteer teachers from the North and donations from civil rights organizations. After Freedom Summer ended in August 1964, most volunteers went home. Local black communities tried to maintain the schools, but lacked resources. Teachers needed to be paid, buildings needed to be rented, materials needed to be purchased. They applied for government funding, both state and federal. They were denied at every level. School districts refused to incorporate freedom school methods or hire their teachers. Northern foundations that had funded civil rights work withdrew support once the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, claiming the battle was won. Without funding, the schools closed one by one. By 1965, most freedom schools were gone. The students who had thrived in them went back to segregated schools designed to keep them ignorant. Adults who had learned to read lost access to continued education. The brief moment of educational freedom was over. The defunding was deliberate. The freedom schools proved that black students could excel when given quality education and treated as capable intellectuals. This exposed segregated schools as deliberately inferior, not because black students couldn't learn, but because white supremacists didn't want them to learn. If this became widely known, pressure for integration and equal funding would become overwhelming. Better to defund the freedom schools and maintain the fiction that black students couldn't learn as well as white students. Better to keep them in underfunded segregated schools that prepared them for menial labor, not college or political leadership. Freedom schools worked. Students learned faster and better than in regular schools. But that success threatened white supremacy. So, the funding disappeared and the schools closed, leaving students back in the failing schools that were designed to keep them uneducated, poor, and powerless. The Highlander Folk School. Founded in 1932 in Tennessee, the Highlander Folk School educated poor white and black workers in labor organizing, civil rights, and community action. For over 3 decades, it trained leaders who went on to transform America and challenge entrenched power structures. Rosa Parks attended workshops at Highlander just months before her Montgomery bus boycott. Martin Luther King Jr. studied there and called it one of the most important institutions in the South. The "We Shall Overcome" anthem of the civil rights movement was popularized at Highlander. Union organizers learned strike strategies there, Community activists developed organizing skills there. An entire generation of civil rights and labor leaders passed through Highlander. The school taught literacy, labor history, constitutional rights, and organizing tactics. Poor workers who had minimal formal education learned to read contracts, understand their legal rights, and organize effectively for better conditions. The education was intensely practical. Students learned skills they could immediately use to improve their lives and communities. The curriculum mixed academic learning with practical organizing. Students studied the history of labor movements, analyzed Supreme Court decisions, and practiced negotiating skills. They learned how to run meetings, build coalitions, and sustain long-term campaigns. The education empowered people to become leaders in their own communities. The education was also revolutionary in breaking down racial barriers. At a time when segregation was legally enforced throughout the South, Highlander was fully integrated. Black and white workers studied together, ate together, and lived together during residential workshops. They learned that poor whites and poor blacks had common interests and common enemies. The Tennessee government hated Highlander. Starting in the 1950s, as Highlander became central to the civil rights movement, the state investigated the school repeatedly, looking for any violation they could use to shut it down. They accused Highlander of being a communist training center, the standard accusation against anyone educating poor people to challenge authority. State agents infiltrated workshops, photographed attendees, and compiled dossiers on students and teachers. The state legislature held hearings attacking Highlander. Newspapers published propaganda calling it a communist conspiracy. Local authorities harassed anyone associated with the school. In 1959, police raided Highlander during a workshop. They arrested Septima Clark, a legendary educator, on charges of selling beer without a license and possessing illegal whiskey. The charges were pretext. The real goal was to create legal grounds to shut down the school. In 1961, the state revoked Highlander's charter and seized its property. The official charge was selling beer without a license and illegal integration, a minor violation and an unjust law they used to destroy a decades-old institution. The real reason was that Highlander was teaching poor people to organize and demand rights, and training the leaders who were desegregating the South. Highlander reopened under a new name, Highlander Research and Education Center, at a new location. But the state harassment continued. Funding became difficult as foundations feared association with an organization labeled subversive. Government grants were impossible. Private donors were investigated by the IRS. Banks refused loans. The school survived but never regained its influence. The golden age of Highlander, the 1940s through early 1960s when it trained the civil rights generation, ended when the state destroyed the original institution and scared off funders. The second iteration continued important work but reached far fewer people with far fewer resources. Highlander's defunding and harassment happened because it educated poor people too effectively. Workers who attended Highlander went home and organized successful strikes that raised wages and improved conditions. Black people who studied there became civil rights leaders who dismantled segregation. Poor whites learned to work with poor blacks instead of fighting each other over scraps. An educated, organized working class is dangerous to those who profit from cheap labor and racial division. Highlander taught poor people that they didn't have to accept poverty as inevitable or natural. They could organize, strike, and demand better. They could challenge laws that oppressed them. This was unacceptable to Tennessee's wealthy elite and to segregationists who depended on racial division. So, Highlander was harassed, shut down, and defunded. Not because it failed to educate. It educated brilliantly and produced legendary leaders, because the people it educated used their education to challenge economic and racial injustice. That success made it a target that had to be destroyed. Operation Head Start. In 1965, Operation Head Start launched as part of President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. The program provided comprehensive early childhood education to poor children, including health care, nutrition, and parental involvement. The original Head Start was revolutionary in scope and ambition. The program didn't just babysit poor children or teach them basic colors and shapes. It provided intensive education, starting at age 3 to 4, treating poor children as capable of the same learning as wealthy children. Children received comprehensive medical and dental care, often their first visits to doctors and dentists. They got nutritious meals, often the only good meals they ate all day. Parents received education on child development, nutrition, and how to support their children's learning. Head Start addressed every barrier to learning that poverty creates. Hungry children can't learn, so Head Start fed them. Sick children can't learn, so Head Start provided health care. Parents who don't understand child development can't support learning, so Head Start educated parents. Head Start worked spectacularly. Studies showed participating children entered kindergarten ready to learn, reading at the same level as middle-class children, knowing numbers and colors, able to sit still and focus. The achievement gap between poor and middle-class children was dramatically narrowed. Health outcomes improved, cavities were filled, vision problems were corrected, developmental delays were identified early. Beyond test scores, Head Start changed life trajectories. Long-term studies showed Head Start participants were more likely to graduate high school, attend college, and earn middle-class incomes as adults. They were less likely to be arrested, less likely to use drugs, less likely to need public assistance. The program broke the cycle of poverty. The original Head Start budget was generous. Teacher-to-student ratios were low, one teacher for every 5 or 6 children. Teachers were well paid with benefits. Facilities were quality buildings with playgrounds and learning materials. Healthcare was comprehensive: vision, dental, medical, mental health. The program had resources to actually accomplish its ambitious mission. Then the defunding began. Almost immediately, Head Start's budget failed to keep pace with inflation or demand. As more families became eligible due to economic changes, funding didn't increase proportionally. Funding per child dropped year after year. Teacher salaries stagnated and then declined in real terms. Facilities deteriorated, class sizes increased. Health services were reduced to bare minimums. By the 1980s, Head Start could only serve about half of eligible children due to underfunding. States had waiting lists of thousands of eligible children. Funding per child had dropped by 30% in real terms from the original program. Teachers were paid poverty wages, often less than $20,000 annually for college-educated professionals. Many centers operated in church basements and deteriorating buildings. The program still worked. Studies continued showing benefits for participating children, but it worked less well because it lacked resources to fulfill its comprehensive mission. The achievement gap remained narrowed, but not eliminated. Health benefits continued, but were less comprehensive. The transformative potential was deliberately constrained. Why was Head Start defunded? Because it worked too well. Poor children who went through high-quality early education entered school ready to learn. They succeeded academically. They went to college at higher rates. They escaped poverty and entered the middle class. This happened on a large enough scale to threaten the social order. American capitalism depends on a pool of low-wage workers. If all the poor children escape poverty through education, who will work minimum wage jobs? Who will clean toilets, pick crops, work in slaughterhouses, staff fast food restaurants? The system requires an underclass of desperate workers willing to accept poverty wages. The defunding was subtle, but deliberate and bipartisan. Congress never eliminated Head Start. That would be politically unpopular and expose the real agenda. They just underfunded it consistently. Never enough money to serve all eligible children. Never enough money per child to provide the comprehensive services that actually worked. Always enough to claim they were helping the poor. Never enough to actually threaten the economic hierarchy. Today, Head Start exists, but is a shadow of its original mission. It serves about 40% of eligible children. 60% are turned away due to lack of funding. Funding per child is inadequate for comprehensive services. Teacher pay is so low that qualified teachers leave for better-paying jobs, creating constant turnover. The program limps along, helping some children, but unable to achieve its transformative potential. Head Start proved poor children could catch up to wealthy children with adequate resources and comprehensive support. That proof was dangerous to those who benefit from poverty and inequality. So the program was slowly defunded until it could no longer deliver on its promise. Not because it failed, because it succeeded. And that success threatened those who benefit from an uneducated underclass. The GI Bill's original scope, the 1944 GI Bill, officially the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, sent 8 million World War II veterans to college, creating the American middle class. It was the most successful educational program in American history. It also accidentally educated a lot of poor people who weren't supposed to get college degrees, and the establishment made sure that accident wouldn't happen again. The original GI Bill paid full tuition to any college or university, covered all fees and books, and provided living stipends adequate to support veterans while they studied. A working-class kid from the Bronx could go to Harvard completely free. A sharecropper's son from Alabama could attend engineering school without any family money. The bill made college accessible to millions who never could have afforded it under any circumstances. The living stipend was crucial. It wasn't just tuition. Veterans received enough money to live on while studying full-time. They didn't have to work while in school. They could focus entirely on education. For many working-class veterans, this was the first time in their lives they could dedicate themselves to learning without simultaneously working to survive. The results were extraordinary. Veterans graduated and became engineers, doctors, teachers, scientists, business owners. They earned far more than their fathers had. They bought houses in new suburbs. They started businesses. They lifted their families into the middle class. The economic boom of the 1950s, 1960s was built on GI Bill-educated veterans. This wasn't the intention. The bill's architects expected most veterans to use it for vocational training, not four-year college degrees. They assumed working-class veterans would become plumbers and mechanics and electricians, not lawyers and professors and scientists. When millions went to college instead and succeeded academically, the establishment panicked. College-educated working-class people turned out to be dangerous to the status quo. They questioned authority. They organized labor unions with educated leadership. They demanded civil rights. They challenged the political establishment. They voted in higher numbers and made informed decisions. The GI Bill had accidentally created an educated class that threatened elite control. The original GI Bill's success exposed class barriers as artificial. It proved that working-class and poor students could succeed at elite universities when given opportunity. Harvard discovered that the kid from the Bronx was just as smart as the kid from wealthy prep schools. This was supposed to stay hidden. So, when the Korean War GI Bill came in 1952, it was reduced. Benefits were lower. Eligibility was more restricted. Coverage wasn't as comprehensive. The Vietnam War GI Bill, passed in 1966, was even stingier. Benefits covered only a fraction of costs. Veterans had to take out loans. Many couldn't afford college even with GI Bill benefits supplementing personal savings. The reduction was deliberate. Congress cited budget concerns, but the real reason was preventing another generation of educated working-class people. The original GI Bill had worked too well at breaking down class barriers. It needed to be constrained. By the 1980s, the GI Bill covered less than half of actual college costs. It no longer provided a realistic path to college for poor veterans. Only middle-class veterans who could supplement benefits with family money could afford college. The transformative power was gone. The post-9/11 GI Bill in 2008 restored more generous benefits, but with restrictions the original bill didn't have. The original bill's power was that it made college completely free for any veteran at any institution. Later versions impose complicated eligibility requirements, limit which schools qualify for full benefits, and create bureaucratic barriers. The defunding happened because the original GI Bill worked too well at educating the poor and working class. It created millions of educated working-class people who challenged authority, organized effectively, and demanded economic justice. The establishment learned that lessen and ensured future GI Bills wouldn't have the same transformative effect. Education for the poor had to be controlled, limited, and constrained to preserve existing hierarchies. Community college open admissions. In the 1960s, 1970s, community colleges expanded rapidly across America with a revolutionary mission: open admissions for anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of academic background. Any high school graduate, or anyone with a GED, could attend. Tuition was free or nearly free, often under $100 per year. Classes were scheduled evenings and weekends for working adults. Community colleges became engines of upward mobility. Adults who had dropped out of high school could get GEDs and then associate degrees. Working-class students could complete general education cheaply, then transfer to universities for bachelor's degrees. Immigrants could learn English and job skills. Single mothers could train for careers while raising children. The door was truly open to anyone. The open admissions mission was explicit and radical: education for anyone who wanted it, regardless of academic background, test scores, or ability to pay. Community colleges would assess student skills with placement tests and provide remedial education if needed. Everyone deserved a chance. If you wanted to learn, community college would teach you. This worked spectacularly. Community colleges educated millions of poor and working-class people who would never have attended college otherwise. Students who had failed in high school succeeded in community college with better teaching, smaller classes, and support services. Associate's degrees led to middle-class jobs. Transfer students completed bachelor's degrees at universities. The graduation rates weren't impressive statistically. Many students juggled work and family while attending part-time, taking years to complete degrees. But huge numbers of people improved their lives through community college. A single mother became a nurse. A factory worker became an accountant. An immigrant became an engineer. The open door policy gave second chances to people the education system had failed the first time. Community colleges also served as paths to universities. A working-class student could attend community college for 2 years, for almost nothing, then transfer to a state university with junior standing. This cut the cost of a bachelor's degree in half and made university accessible to students who couldn't afford 4 years of university tuition. Then the defunding began. State funding for community colleges dropped throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. States cut higher education budgets generally, and community colleges were cut deepest because they served the poorest students with the least political power. Tuition rose from free to hundreds to thousands of dollars per year. Class sizes increased as fewer professors were hired. Remedial programs were cut. Support services like tutoring and counseling disappeared. Library hours were reduced. Course offerings shrank. The mission changed from open access to completion agenda. Federal and state governments pressured community colleges to increase graduation rates as a metric of success. Instead of accepting everyone and providing support to help them succeed, community colleges were pushed to admit only students likely to graduate quickly. Remedial education was cut because it lowered completion statistics. Students who needed basic math or English before taking college-level courses were seen as dragging down graduation rates. Some colleges eliminated remedial programs entirely. Others made remedial courses non-credit, meaning students had to pay for courses that didn't count toward degrees. Students who needed remedial help, the students' community colleges were originally designed to serve, were pushed out. Placement tests became barriers to admission instead of diagnostic tools to determine what support students needed. Students testing below college level were denied admission entirely or shunted to non-credit remedial courses that cost money but didn't lead anywhere. The defunding killed the open door. Community colleges that once accepted everyone now reject students deemed unlikely to graduate quickly. Tuition that was free now costs thousands, creating debt for the poorest students. Support services that helped struggling students succeed are gone due to budget cuts. The transformative open access mission was abandoned. Why? Because community colleges were too successful at educating the poor and working class. They were creating too many educated working class people who competed for middle class jobs, demanded higher wages, organized unions, and threatened the economic hierarchy that requires a large pool of uneducated workers willing to accept low wages. Open admissions meant poor people could access education and escape poverty. This threatened employers who depended on desperate workers. If workers could go to college and get better jobs, who would work at Walmart and McDonald's for minimum wage? Who would clean office buildings and pick crops and process chickens? The defunding was deliberate and coordinated. States cut funding while simultaneously demanding higher graduation rates, an impossible combination. Community colleges were forced to choose between open access and adequate funding. Most chose funding and closed the door on the poorest students. The transformation was ideological too. The original mission, education for anyone who wants it, was replaced with market logic. Community colleges should serve workforce needs, training workers for existing jobs rather than educating people to question why those jobs pay so little. The focus shifted from transformation to job training, from education to credentialing. Community colleges still exist, but no longer fulfill their original revolutionary mission. They're affordable compared to universities, but not accessible to the poorest students who can't afford even reduced tuition. They're open compared to selective colleges, but not open to students needing significant remediation. The transformative open door that gave millions a second chance has been closed through deliberate defunding. The Neighborhood Youth Corps. Launched in 1965 as part of President Johnson's War on Poverty, the Neighborhood Youth Corps provided part-time jobs to poor teenagers while they stayed in school. The program paid students minimum wage to attend school, do homework, and learn job skills while working part-time in community organizations. The concept was simple and based on understanding what actually keeps poor teenagers from succeeding in school: poverty. Poor teenagers drop out not because they're lazy or stupid, but because their families need their income. Pay them to go to school instead of dropping out to work minimum wage jobs, and they'll stay in school and graduate. The program paid $1.25 an hour for 10-15 hours per week of part-time work. Students worked in schools, libraries, parks, hospitals, and community organizations. They earned 50-75s every 2 weeks, enough to help their families pay rent and buy food while staying enrolled in school instead of dropping out to work full-time at fast food restaurants or factories. It worked brilliantly. Dropout rates in participating schools fell dramatically, in some schools by 50% or more. Poor students who would have left school at 16 to work stayed enrolled because the Corps paid them enough to help their families. Graduation rates rose. College enrollment from poor neighborhoods increased as students who would have dropped out graduated and continued their education. Students didn't just receive money, they learned real job skills. Working in libraries taught organization and customer service. Working in parks taught maintenance and responsibility. Working in schools as tutors taught teaching skills. Students gained work experience and job references while staying in school. The program served over 500,000 teenagers annually at its peak. For poor families, the income was significant, $200, $300 per month, that helped pay bills and kept families afloat. For students, it meant being able to stay in school without the guilt of not contributing financially to struggling families. For communities, it meant better educated young people and reduced crime. Students testified that the Neighborhood Youth Corps was the only reason they finished high school. They would have dropped out at 16 to work and help their families. The Corps let them do both, help their families financially while staying in school and getting an education that would lift them out of poverty permanently. The program also taught students that poverty wasn't their fault. When you're paid to stay in school and you succeed, you learn that poverty was the barrier, not your ability or motivation. This political education was as important as the academic education. The Neighborhood Youth Corps was steadily defunded through the 1970s and completely eliminated by the Reagan administration in 1981. Reagan called it wasteful government spending. The official justification was budget cuts and reducing the deficit. The real reason was that it was educating poor teenagers too effectively. Poor teenagers who graduated high school because of the Corps went to college. They became educated adults who demanded decent jobs and fair wages. They unionized workplaces, they organized communities, they voted in higher numbers. They didn't accept poverty as inevitable or natural. They understood that poverty was a policy choice, not a personal failing. The program threatened the pool of cheap teenage labor that low-wage industries depend on. Fast food restaurants, retail stores, warehouses, and agricultural operations all depended on poor teenagers willing to work for minimum wage. The Corps reduced that labor pool by keeping students in school. Employers lost access to desperate teenage workers. More threatening politically, the Corps proved that poverty, not laziness or stupidity, was why students dropped out. If you paid poor students enough to help their families, they stayed in school and succeeded. This contradicted conservative ideology that blamed poverty on personal failure rather than systemic inequality. If poverty was the problem, then the solution was giving poor families money, a solution unacceptable to those who believed poverty was a moral failing that should be punished, not a systemic problem that should be solved. The core proved that paying poor people worked. That proof had to be eliminated. The defunding was partisan and ideological. Republicans opposed paying students to attend school, calling it a handout that encouraged dependency. They argued students should stay in school because it's the right thing to do, deliberately ignoring that many students couldn't afford that choice when their families needed their income to avoid homelessness and hunger. The core was eliminated despite overwhelming evidence it worked, despite clear data showing reduced dropout rates and increased graduation rates, despite testimony from students and families whose lives were changed. It was defunded precisely because it worked, because keeping poor teenagers in school and helping them graduate threatened those who benefited from an uneducated underclass willing to work for poverty wages. Upward Bound. Started in 1964 as part of the War on Poverty, Upward Bound provides intensive academic support to low-income high school students preparing for college. Students attend summer programs at universities, receive tutoring and mentoring during the school year, and get comprehensive help with college applications and financial aid. Upward Bound works. Participating students attend college at significantly higher rates than similar students who don't participate, around 67% versus 50%. They're more likely to complete bachelor's degrees, around 45% versus 30%. They earn substantially more over their lifetimes. The program demonstrably breaks the cycle of poverty through education. The summer programs are transformative. Low-income students spend 6 weeks living on a college campus, taking college prep courses taught by university professors, and experiencing college life firsthand. Many participants are first-generation college students whose parents never finished high school or attended college. For them, 6 weeks on campus demystifies college and makes it feel achievable rather than impossible. Students take advanced classes in math, science, English, and foreign languages. They work on college essays and practice for SATs. They meet with admissions counselors and learn how financial aid works. They study with other motivated low-income students and realize they're not alone. The experience transforms how students see themselves and their futures. During the school year, students receive tutoring, mentoring, and continued academic support. They meet regularly with Upward Bound counselors who help them navigate high school, choose challenging courses, and prepare for college. When application time comes, counselors help students apply to schools and for financial aid. Complex processes that middle-class students get help with from parents and private counselors, but that low-income students often fail to navigate successfully on their own. The program serves about 60,000 students annually, but over 2 million students are eligible based on income and first-generation status. Upward Bound has resources to serve only 3% of students who qualify. 97% of eligible students can't participate because there's no funding to serve them. This isn't because the program doesn't work or isn't cost-effective. The data clearly shows Upward Bound succeeds at its mission. It's because the program is deliberately underfunded to limit how many poor students escape poverty through education. Funding has been essentially flat in nominal terms for decades, despite inflation and increasing need. In real terms, adjusted for inflation, funding per student has dropped by 40% since the 1980s. Programs that served 100 students in 1985 now serve 60 with the same funding. Programs have waiting lists of hundreds of eligible students they can't serve due to lack of resources. The underfunding is bipartisan and consistent across administrations. Republican administrations regularly propose eliminating Upward Bound entirely, calling it wasteful spending. Democratic administrations preserve it, but don't fight hard for adequate funding increases. Both parties agree that keeping funding minimal and limiting the program's reach is acceptable. Why? Because Upward Bound succeeds too well at sending poor students to college. Those students escape poverty, earn middle-class incomes, and compete for jobs with students from wealthy families. This threatens the economic hierarchy that sorts people into classes based largely on family wealth. College was supposed to be for wealthy and middle-class students. It was supposed to reproduce class advantage. Wealthy parents send their children to college, those children earn professional incomes, and the cycle continues. Upward Bound sends poor students to college and helps them graduate. This disrupts class reproduction. When more poor students attend college, it dilutes the value of college degrees for wealthy students. It increases competition for spots at good colleges and for good jobs after graduation. Wealthy parents don't want their children competing with motivated low-income students who worked harder to get to college. The program also exposes inequality in ways that threaten the system. When Upward Bound students attend summer programs, they see that wealthy students have resources poor students lack: private tutoring, test prep courses, college counselors, parental connections. They learn that their poverty and lack of opportunity aren't personal failings, but results of systemic inequality. Educated poor people who understand systemic inequality are dangerous. They don't accept poverty as natural or deserved. They demand economic justice. They vote for redistribution. They organize for change. They teach their children to question why some people are rich while others are poor. Better to keep them uneducated and unaware than to risk them learning why they're poor and demanding change. So, Upward Bound survives, but severely underfunded, helping the small percentage of students it can serve, while leaving millions of eligible students without access. The defunding is deliberate. Enough funding to look like we're helping the poor, but nowhere near enough to actually threaten the economic hierarchy that keeps them poor. Prison education programs. In the 1970s and 1980s, prisons across America offered extensive education programs including high school equivalency preparation, vocational training, and college courses through Pell Grants. Inmates could earn associate and bachelor's degrees while incarcerated, transforming themselves through education. The programs worked extraordinarily well at reducing recidivism and crime. The data was overwhelming. Studies consistently showed inmates who participated in education programs were 43% less likely to return to prison after release. Those who earned college degrees had recidivism rates under 10%, compared to 60 or 70% for the general prison population who received no education. Education was far and away the most effective intervention for reducing crime. The programs were cost-effective too. College courses cost about $5,000 per inmate annually through Pell Grants. Keeping someone in prison costs $35,000 plus annually, often much more in high-cost states. Every inmate who earned a degree and didn't return to prison saved taxpayers decades of incarceration costs, easily over $500,000 per person over a lifetime. Inmates transformed their lives through education. People who had dropped out of high school at 16 to sell drugs earned GEDs, then associate degrees, then bachelor's degrees. They studied business, computer science, psychology, liberal arts. They became educated people who could think critically, write clearly, and get decent jobs after release instead of returning to crime. The education wasn't just vocational. College courses taught inmates to analyze texts, construct arguments, understand history and economics. They learned to see themselves and their circumstances differently. Many inmates said college was the first time in their lives they were treated as intelligent people, capable of complex thought. In 1994, Congress eliminated Pell Grant eligibility for prisoners as part of the crime bill. This killed prison college programs overnight. Without Pell Grants, inmates couldn't pay tuition. Without tuition money, colleges stopped offering prison classes. Within a few years, prison college programs nearly disappeared from the American prison system. The ban was purely punitive with no evidence-based justification. Congress argued criminals didn't deserve taxpayer-funded education that law-abiding poor people couldn't access. This was cynical framing. The solution was expanding Pell Grants for poor people generally, not eliminating them for prisoners. The ban ignored overwhelming evidence that educating inmates reduced crime, saved money, and made communities safer. Politicians knew the programs worked. Studies had shown the dramatic reduction in recidivism. They defunded them anyway because they believed criminals should suffer, not receive education that might help them become productive citizens. But There's a deeper reason the programs were eliminated. Educated ex-inmates compete for jobs with other workers. They don't accept minimum wage. They know their rights. They're harder to exploit. An uneducated ex-inmate with a felony record and no skills has almost no options except crime or minimum wage labor. An educated ex-inmate with a degree can demand decent pay and conditions. The prison industrial complex also directly benefits from high recidivism. Private prisons profit from high incarceration rates. More inmates means more revenue. Prison guard unions lobby for policies that increase incarceration to protect jobs and pensions. Entire rural towns depend economically on prisons for employment. Reducing recidivism through education threatens all these interests. Corporations benefit too. Prison labor is used by major corporations at wages of pennies per hour. Educated inmates who don't return to prison aren't available for this essentially slave labor. Better to keep them uneducated, likely to reoffend, and cycling through prisons where they provide cheap labor. Most cynically, educated ex-inmates with restored voting rights vote and organize. They advocate for criminal justice reform. They testify about prison conditions. They challenge tough-on-crime politicians. They threaten the political establishment that built careers on mass incarceration. Better to keep them uneducated, likely to reoffend and lose voting rights, and unable to effectively challenge the system. The racial dimension was explicit. The 1994 crime bill that banned Pell Grants for prisoners also dramatically expanded incarceration, particularly of black men. Eliminating prison education ensured that the millions of black men being imprisoned would remain uneducated and likely to reoffend, creating a permanent underclass of disenfranchised black men cycling through prisons. Some states have restored limited prison education recently, using state funds or private grants to offer some college courses. But it's a tiny fraction of what existed before 1994. Most inmates have no access to college education. The programs that proved most effective at reducing crime and transforming lives remain defunded because their success threatens too many powerful interests that benefit from high recidivism and mass incarceration. The Adult Literacy Initiative. In 1991, Congress passed the National Literacy Act, creating a comprehensive federal program to eliminate adult illiteracy in America. The program funded literacy education for the estimated 40 million American adults who couldn't read well enough to function in modern society, couldn't read job applications, medicine labels, their children's report cards, or voting materials. The initiative provided federal grants to community organizations, libraries, adult schools, and community colleges to offer free literacy classes to adults who had been failed by the education system, who had dropped out or been pushed out of school, who had learned English as a second language without learning to read, could finally attend classes and learn. The program was working. Attendance at literacy programs increased dramatically with federal funding. Adult learners progressed through reading levels, from non-readers to basic literacy to functional literacy. Graduation rates from literacy programs rose. Lives were transformed as adults gained the ability to read for the first time in their lives. The funding was never adequate for the scale of the problem. 40 million illiterate adults and only about $500 million in annual federal funding plus varying state contributions. But it was a start, and it was growing. Programs were expanding to serve more students. More adults were learning to read each year. The trajectory was toward gradually eliminating adult illiteracy. Then funding was slashed. By the late 1990s, federal adult literacy funding had been cut by 60% in real terms adjusted for inflation. Programs lost funding and closed. Waiting lists grew from weeks to months to years. Adults who desperately wanted to learn to read couldn't find classes with openings. The defunding happened despite America's adult illiteracy crisis getting worse, not better, despite overwhelming evidence that literacy programs worked when properly funded. Despite the obvious societal benefit of having literate adults who could read medicine bottles, follow written instructions, and participate fully in democracy, the programs were deliberately underfunded. Why? Because illiterate adults are easier to control and exploit than literate adults. They can't read contracts, so they sign predatory loans and rental agreements without understanding the terms. They can't read medicine labels, so they take incorrect doses and end up hospitalized. They can't read voter information guides, so they vote based on what they're told by others, or don't vote at all. Illiterate workers are easier to cheat and abuse. They can't read pay stubs to catch wage theft. They can't read safety regulations to identify violations and report employers. They can't read the fine print in employment contracts that waive their rights. They can't read union materials or labor law posters. Employers benefit enormously from an illiterate workforce that can't effectively advocate for itself. Literate adults understand their rights and demand them. They read news critically and form independent political opinions. They research political candidates instead of voting based on name recognition or what they're told. They question authority because they can read and verify information for themselves. This threatens political and economic establishments that depend on an ignorant population that doesn't question what they're told. The defunding was also deeply racist. Adult illiteracy rates are highest among Black and Hispanic adults, populations that have been systematically denied quality education for generations. Teaching these adults to read would empower communities that have been kept powerless through deliberate educational deprivation and denial of literacy. An illiterate Black or Hispanic population is easier to exploit economically and control politically. Teaching them to read threatens white supremacist power structures that depend on racial inequality. Better to keep them illiterate under the excuse of budget constraints than to risk them learning to read and organizing for racial and economic justice. Today, adult literacy programs exist, but serve only a tiny fraction of adults who need them. Waiting lists are months or years long in most cities. Programs turn away desperate adults who want to learn to read because there's no funding to serve them. Classes are overcrowded when they exist at all. Volunteer tutors fill gaps but can't replace comprehensive programs. America has 54 million functionally illiterate adults, according to recent estimates. Over 1 in 5 adults can't read well enough to function in modern society. We have the resources to teach them all to read with properly funded programs. We choose not to because literate adults are harder to exploit and control. The literacy programs were defunded because they worked, because educated adults threaten systems that require ignorance to function. An illiterate population accepts what they're told. A literate population questions, verifies, and demands accountability. That's exactly why literacy programs for poor adults remain chronically underfunded, despite overwhelming evidence they work. 10 programs that educated the poor and were defunded. All of them worked. Freire taught literacy in 45 days. Freedom schools helped students excel. Highlander trained leaders. Head Start narrowed achievement gaps. The GI Bill created the middle class. Community colleges educated millions. Neighborhood Youth Corps reduced dropouts. Upward Bound sends poor students to college. Prison education cut recidivism by 43%. Literacy programs taught adults to read. They were defunded because educated poor people are dangerous. An illiterate worker can't read contracts. A literate worker organizes for fair wages. An uneducated child accepts poverty. An educated child questions why poverty exists. An ignorant worker blames immigrants. An educated worker understands that employers profit from division. Every program threatened power or profits. Educated workers demand higher wages. Educated Black people fight racism. Educated poor people escape poverty, reducing the pool of desperate workers. So, the programs were destroyed through coups, bombings, property seizures, slow funding starvation, and deliberate neglect. The education system isn't designed to educate the poor. It's designed to keep them ignorant and compliant. We could educate every poor child with adequate Head Start funding. We could send every capable student to college through Upward Bound. We could eliminate adult illiteracy. We could reduce recidivism to nearly zero through prison education. We have the resources and proven methods. We choose not to use them because educated poor people threaten economic and political hierarchies. 10 programs that succeeded at educating the poor. 10 programs defunded because success is dangerous. Because an educated underclass isn't an underclass anymore.